In early April 1945, the Second World War had not necessarily developed in Germany's favor, especially the ships of the Kriegsmarine, of which a majority of the larger surface ships had been sunk already. However, the major port city and primary Baltic base for the Kriegsmarine, Kiel, had several large vessels in it at the end of the war, namely the heavy cruisers Admiral Scheer and Admiral Hipper, along with the first major warship the German Navy built after the First World War, the light cruiser Emden. In early April, these three ships were in various states of readiness, ranging from the Admiral Scheer, who had been employed in bombardment missions and ferrying refugees very recently, to the drydocked and still damaged Admiral Hipper. Over the coming weeks, each of the vessels was bombed by the RAF in successive air raids of Kiel. Each of the cruisers was damaged and eventually sunk in Kiel. The ships were found in their respective states of disrepair by the advancing Allies. Over the coming years, each of the ships was scrapped in Kiel. In today's video, we'll look at some context how each ship ended up in Kiel and their respective fates. Starting off with the Admiral Hipper, the ship had sustained damage during the disastrous Battle of the Barents Sea in late 1942, and due to the outcome of the battle, Adolf Hitler ordered the decommissioning of all ships of the size of light cruisers and above. It's safe to say the Mustache Man was a whole new level of angry, causing Admiral Schrader to resign, while Karl Dönitz took over as head of the Kriegsmarine, getting the order partially rescinded. Still, the Admiral Hipper in early January 1943 made temporary repairs in Norway and returned to Germany in late February for further repairs and decommissioning. Due to the worsening situation in the air, Admiral Hipper was transferred from Wilhelmshaven to Pilau in April with a skeleton crew aboard. For the remainder of the year, nothing of note happened to the ship, as due to the decommissioning order, the Admiral Hipper remained in Pilau. Where things get interesting again is in March 1944, when the ship was recommissioned as a cadet training ship. A lot of the remaining surface ships were turned into cadet training ships, including the last German battleship afloat at the end of the war, the Schlesien. Link in the description for that video. Anyway, the boiler room that was damaged in the Battle of the Barents Sea was still inoperable and remained shut down. The ship ran trials in the Baltic from April to August. In September, she was declared conditionally operational. Following the first cadet training course, which ended in October, the ship was ordered to come to readiness for shore bombardment duties, something that a majority of the remaining Kriegsmarine units were doing. However, in November, the crew was employed in other work, namely digging anti-tank ditches outside Gdynia, what the Germans called Gottenhofen. I know all my little Polish nationalists are happy in the comments now. The ship was confined to port after an extensive mining campaign by the Royal Air Force in December. In January 1945, crew members were again sent away from the ship to aid in the construction of more fortifications in the area, a task I'm sure they were thrilled about, considering the war situation. Meanwhile, the cruiser went to the yard in Gottenhofen halfway through the month. Due to further air attacks and the advancing Soviet army, the repair work was hampered. By the end of the month, the ship was used to carry refugees to Kiel, some 1,500 people. While on this voyage, the ship passed the sinking liner Wilhelm Gustloff, and cruised through survivors still in the water, unable to stop because of the danger of Soviet submarines. By the 1st of February, the cruiser was secured in Kiel at the Deutsche Werke shipyard for boiler restoration work. A little over a month later, on April 3, 1945, the ship was bombed. By this time, Allied bombers were operating virtually unopposed in the air and were mainly threatened by scattered concentrations of anti-aircraft guns. Sure, the Luftwaffe still existed, but I don't think any of the Wunderwaffen was going to save the major German cities. Hans in the De Glocke wasn't going to stop all those bombers, but the civilian population of the cities had to hide in cellars, bunkers, or ruins, especially in the bombed-out city of Kiel. In the bombing raid of April 3rd, the ship received a direct hit on the starboard side, and 6 crew members were killed. On the 9th, in another bombing raid, the one that devastated the Admiral Scheer also devastated the Admiral Hipper, as the RAF dropped some 2,634 tons of explosives on the city, and I'm sure making Arthur Harris rather proud. 3 more direct hits destroyed the Admiral Hipper's upper works and superstructure, as you can see from this photo, which does an excellent job illustrating the carnage of the raid and the damage done to the Admiral Hipper. especially in the foreground, the superstructure, and the funnel. The crew was not on board when the raid took place, taking shelter in nearby U-boat pens. Another great photo taken by British authorities, this one in color, taken from the rear of the ship, also does an excellent job illustrating the damage done to the Admiral Hipper. Notice the damage here, and the overall condition of the ship. This is probably the most famous photo besides those of the Admiral Scheer capsized in Kiel after the war, at least for us naval history nerds. Whoa, folks. I need to be a YouTuber for once and ask you all to subscribe. Only a handful of you who watch are actually subscribed, and it would really help me out a lot if you did. I know a lot of you think this call to action is corny and stupid, but it really does help, and I'd really appreciate it if you all took a second and subscribed. The wreck of the Admiral Hipper was essentially useless now, as the bombs had devastated the ship and certainly beyond any of the means of repair the Germans could have conducted at the time. So when May rolled around, the ship was scuttled in its dry dock. Then, when the British took over the city in May, the ship was found in that condition. To take from Aidan Dodson and Serena Kant in Spoils of War the fate of enemy fleets after 2 world wars, on May 23rd, a British status report on the vessels in Kiel noted that T-1, lying on her side, S-201, and M-801 had been blown up on May 20th, and the following day, depth charges had been detonated under the hulks of Admiral Hipper and Emden. This was judged enough to render the ships destroyed by the deadline. The wrecks were broken up in situ from 1948 onwards. The Eisen und Metall concern had quoted for their scrapping in April. In July, under the supervision of British authorities, the remains were raised and towed out into Heikendorf Bay and beached so the scrapping process could begin. The scrapping process began in April 1948 and lasted until 1952, where in this photo, the Admiral Hipper is suffering from an accidental fire as she was dumped in shallow water after the removal from drydock in June 1945. Refloating of the Admiral Hipper was not permitted by the Potsdam Agreement, since she was not forming an obstruction to navigation. Rather, her hull was damaged beyond salvage by the detonation of those charges we discussed earlier, and thus not worthy of saving, being scrapped over the coming years, although I'm sure the Soviets would have liked to get their hands on her. Moving on to the next ship, the Emden. It was the first ship the Germans designed and built after the First World War. The ship was based on the design for the Karlsruhe of the Cullen class from the Imperial Navy, with some allowances for wartime experience. However, the Allied Controlled Commission hampered the design, requiring the guns to be in single gun houses. The Allied Control Commission was rather harsh with Emden, telling the Germans to repeatedly go back to the drawing board, making her gun layout rather outdated. Still, out of the German light cruisers built in the interwar period, she was the most seaworthy, as both the Königsberg and Leipzig classes were a bit, well, they were terrible. But by the time the Second World War came around, Emden was older and because of her design, not the most useful cruiser. Her most notable operation was assisting in the assault on Oslo Fjord in the spring of 1940 and witnessing the sinking of the Bluche, even taking damage herself. After making it to Oslo and eventually returning to Germany, Emden and the other light cruisers were relegated to training ships, a dubious role that would change as the war developed, seeing service in the Baltic and in Norway between 1940 and 1944. Between June and November 1942, she went into dry dock for extensive work to her superstructure, where I think a quote from German light cruisers of World War II, Warships of the Kriegsmarine by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke is apt. Although the ship achieved 26.9 knots in its engine trials, a major engine overhaul was indicated, for she had been in service for almost 16 years, and despite the changeover from coal to oil-firing boilers, she retained her original engines. Nevertheless, the financial and military situation made the postponement of a machinery refit inevitable. Still, she operated in 1943 in that condition and into 1944, where in September, Emden helped to lay mines in Norwegian waters, operating out of Horten and in the Skagerrak. She next assisted in covering troop ships moving in and out of Oslo Fjord, even running aground in December where she was holed in Compartment 2, and this damage, combined with the general condition of the machinery, led to repairs in the city of Königsberg. The process was very slow, and by January 23, 1945, As Soviet troops closed in on the city, she was prepared to leave with the coffins of Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his wife and to take them to Pilau. The ship arrived in Pilau with tug assistance at 3 a.m. on the 25th. After unloading the coffins and conducting makeshift repairs, Emden took on board refugees, like other Kriegsmarine ships in this video, and arrived in Kiel on February 1st after a 6-day voyage at the mercy of Soviet submarines and aircraft. The ship arrived in Kiel and went to the Deutsche Werke shipyard, where Emden was subjected to continual air raids. On the 11th of March, the ship was damaged by incendiary bombs. The April 3rd raid also damaged Emden, destroying her forward funnel with a direct hit. In the air raid on April 9th, which wrecked the Admiral Scheer and the Admiral Hipper, Emden was damaged in her stern by a near miss. She was also next seriously damaged on the night of the 13th and towed out into Heikendorf Bay with a 15-degree list to port. Once the hull had been sealed, the cruiser was grounded in shallow water and decommissioned on April 26th. On May 3rd, the ship was scuttled by explosive charges. An interesting photo is this one, where alongside Emden, you can see a U-boat. Again, this photo is taken by British authorities sometime between May 6th and the 12th, 1945. Or this photograph where you can see a better overall view of the ship and its condition, in which you can see the destroyed forward funnel, along with this one with a better view of the U-boat, which at first glance I thought there were two, but there's in fact only one. Much like the Admiral Hipper, the ship was scrapped over the coming years and placed in Heikendorf Bay. Finally, we come to the Admiral Scheer. As 1945 dawned and a major Soviet offensive developed from the Barents bridgehead in mid-January, vastly superior forces advanced on the German homeland itself, and the few available elements of the German surface fleet became involved in the upcoming battles between German and Soviet forces, as floating artillery batteries against Soviet assembly points and advancing columns of troops. Here's some interesting footage of the Prince Eugen bombarding Soviet positions in 1944. But Admiral Scheer spent most of January in Pilau engaging in those duties, then off the Zamland coast in company with a few remaining torpedo boats. At 11 p.m. on the 18th of January 1945 at Pilau, Admiral Scheer made to the east astern of the night fighter direction ship Togo, while she brought around to give full broadside to bear shoreward. Before dawn on the 19th, Admiral Scheer unleashed her 6 28cm guns and portside 15cm battery in support of the German land offensive to reopen the Königsberg-Pilau land corridor for the escape of refugees. By first light, the heavy cruiser retired offshore due to Soviet air superiority, although the Soviets weren't the best at engaging naval targets. Still, better to be safe than sorry. The ship returned at the same time the following day to bombard Soviet positions for 2 hours from 5 to 7, the objective of their action being achieved. Like other ships of the Kriegsmarine, she was enlisted in the care of refugees, protecting overfilled hospital trains and ships, helping wounded aboard those other means of transportation. The desperation of the situation in East Prussia at the time called for almost everything that could float to be pressed into service to carry refugees, with small parties from the ship going ashore to secure incomplete torpedo boat hulls to be towed westward. The fall of Königsberg is a fascinating story and something I recommend you look into. Off Elbing on February 6th, Admiral Scheer bombarded Soviet lines at a range of 35 kilometers, expending over 1,000 rounds of her 28cm and 15cm guns. As a result of this and similar operations off Pilau, her guns were in urgent need of reboring. The only workshop that had the machinery to rebore her guns was in Kiel, so the cruiser sailed for the battered German city, in the process taking refugees and wounded from Gottenhofen. No surprise there, as we know the Kriegsmarine was becoming more of a transportation unit than anything else. On March 9th, the captain of the Admiral Scheer was told that he could no longer proceed as there was an uncleared minefield, and so he took his ship to Swinemunde to disembark passengers. Upon arrival, the Admiral Scheer was pressed into service once again by the army to bombard advancing Soviet troop columns. Over the coming days, the Admiral Scheer expended over 700 rounds of her 28cm guns and 15cm shells, really pushing the life expectancy of those barrels. As there was no 15cm ammunition in Swinemunde, the cruiser finally sailed for Kiel, not before taking on more refugees and wounded, arriving on March 18th, where she was sent to the fitting out basin of the Deutsche Werke near the Admiral Hipper and Emden. As I previously mentioned, by this time, Allied bombers were operating virtually unopposed in the air and were mainly threatened by scattered concentrations of anti-aircraft guns. To help in the defenses, the anti-aircraft guns and ammunition aboard the Admiral Scheer were taken off to hopefully provide for the defenses of the city and the surrounding area. Unfortunately for the Admiral Scheer, her heavy armament was unserviceable because of the proposed barrel changeovers. B-Turret completed the exchange on the 8th of April, and because of the constant threat of air attacks, a proposal to bring the ship out into Heikendorf Bay was put forward on the 10th to have a floating crane assist in the exchange of turret barrels. Some of the ship's company had disembarked, including most of the cadets. So the following night when bombers came overhead, a majority of the ship's company was off the ship. Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke have this to say in their book Pocket Battleships of the Deutschland class, Warships of the Kriegsmarine. At 9:50 on the 9th of April, there was an air raid warning, and most of the remaining crewmen went to bunkers ashore, leaving aboard 90 or so officers and men of the damage control parties. The first bombs began falling at 10:30, and the ship was first hit at 10:38 p.m. At 10:45, hits caused lighting and command relay systems to fail, and the cruiser assumed a list of 16 degrees to starboard, but power was restored long enough to get ground vents and make compensatory flooding to halt the list at just 18 degrees. At just after 10:45, as a consequence of further hits and near misses, the list increased quickly to 28 degrees, at which point in time, the engineer officer of the watch gave the command to leave the electrical plant running and gave the command to abandon the ship. The order did not reach all of the centers because of the electrical failures, although individual posts were abandoned as soon as the gravity of the situation became apparent. The remaining crew climbed through burning and smoke-filled rooms to reach companionways and portholes. Some crewmen were killed or injured by falling machinery and components. Despite the asphyxiating condition and their exhaustion, groups dragged injured and unconscious shipmates to safety, those not being able to swim the few strokes to the quayside being picked up in the water by small craft. Salvage workers from Emden cut into the hull in several places, and rescue teams scoured the upturned hull for 42 hours in search of survivors. Having discharged her ammunition and fuel, Admiral Scheer was high out of the water and ballasted with a small amount of seawater in the double bottom. She capsized over a period of about 12 to 17 minutes in 15 meters of water, the primary cause being the large gash on the starboard side caused by near misses. All 8 members of Damage Control Party 1 and 7 other crew members, including 3 engineer cadets, were left entombed in the mangled remains of the ship. The mangled remains of the Admiral Scheer and other German vessels were captured in the devastated city of Kiel by the advancing British forces in early May 1945. Kiel was largely destroyed in World War II, especially the dock area, since this was a major port city for Germany and the Kriegsmarine. Where in this photo you can see the mine layer Bruma, the former Norwegian Olav Tryggvason, and a Type 21 U-boat. There are a number of photos taken of Admiral Scheer, mostly taken by British authorities, like this one, which reveals 2 things. A really good view of the capsized warship, with a prefabricated bow of a Type 21 U-boat in the foreground, and the valuable metals that could be salvaged from the warship. Or in this photo where you can see the capsized warship in the ruined dockyard, along with the bombed-out city of Kiel in the background. The armor plate and propellers contain metals that could be reused for other applications. So under the British authorities, work began on breaking up the wrecks in July 1945, where all valuable metals, gun houses, and turrets were removed before the bare torso of the ship was abandoned where she lay. It seems the ship was broken up in a number of ways, being cut up with welding torches and the possible use of explosives. As the scrapping process got underway, the ship was moved slightly to allow for the scrappers to get to parts of the ship that were above the waterline and not below the water. Much of the scrap metal went on to Britain to be processed, and by the following July, the scrappers had come to a completion because the cost of further efforts to scrap her was too expensive, as it would require the ship to be towed elsewhere to finish the job. The Brits got all the expensive stuff they wanted off the ship, and so what was left of the Admiral Scheer, which were pieces of the hull, were left where they sat. By 1949, the reconstruction of West Germany was beginning, and the principal Baltic naval base for the future and past German navies was no exception. So when it came time to begin building the new naval arsenal, The remains of the mangled hull were covered over with rubble to become part of the foundation of a new large parking lot, with the ship's remains being in this area. As for the crew that was entombed in the ship, I could not find a source that said they were removed from the ship, so they're most likely there. According to a survey from the Institute of Geosciences of Kiel University, which I'll place a link to that survey so you all can read it, the wreck was partially cleared after the war, with the bow removed up to the forward engineering spaces, and the stern was removed at the beginning of the armor belt, with the remaining midship section cleared down to the waterline, and subsequently buried by sand and other debris in the early 1950s, as I mentioned before. Using photographs from after the time she had capsized, and specifically this one from March 29, 1949, the research team used the surrounding buildings that are still there today to find the approximate location of the buried Admiral Scheer, and through the use of magnetic gradiometry, ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic induction, and electrical resistivity tomography were used to help find the remains of the Admiral Scheer, which I can definitely assure you all those are way above my head. The report concluded by stating that the photograph from March 29, 1949 represents the state in which the Admiral Scheer was buried, where they claim large parts of the hull and superstructure have been preserved, though buried under 3 meters or about 10 feet of sand and debris. You should really go take a look at the paper, it's very interesting, and they have some models they made using the scans, which are amazing. There were a number of other vessels in Kiel at the time of the surrender, including destroyers, torpedo boats, submarines, mine layers, and more. For the most part, the remaining ships, incomplete or not, were either distributed to the victorious powers or broken up. For example, some of Germany's most advanced U-boats were in Kiel, and those Wunderwaffen were desired by all the Allies, specifically the incomplete Type 23 that can be seen in this picture. Again, these were divided up amongst the Allies, with each nation trying to take the best of the best for themselves, mostly the Western Allies trying to take ships and tech away from the Soviets. I hope you all enjoyed this video. It's kind of a last hurrah for weekly videos, as things are going to slow down a bit. Basically, I have to start my actual job. Gross, I know, but such is life. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.